This is interesting. The front page, as I said, the Sunday Telegraph this morning, Rachel Reeves desperate to try and get onto the front foot. She says she will launch a war on waste to stabilise public finances amid growing disquiet from her MPs over the handling of the economy. I think it is a fair assumption to say that the whole thing has been pretty disastrous. When you look at the way the markets have turned on her, she's even got her own fiscal rules, which she looks like she's going to break. She doesn't have the fiscal headroom that she thought she would have. She's spending £100 billion more than the Tory plans. You've got Lord Spencer saying she's got herself into a catastrophic mess. When she says she's going to wage war on waste, is this going to be enough to turn the tide of opinion, particularly her own backbenchers against her?
I wouldn't have thought so, David. I mean, I wish I had a pound for every time a government of any colour has said they're going to wage a war on waste and improve efficiency. We'd probably be able to wipe out the budget deficit if that were the case. I mean, yeah, it tends to be the last resort of a Chancellor who is running out of options, who can't get their hands on any money. You know, she's really boxed herself in here. She said that she won't raise taxes again after the last budget obviously raised £40 billion worth of taxes. They can't borrow anymore because, as we've seen in the last few days, the cost of government borrowing has gone up to record levels certainly over the last 15 years. So the only other option really is cuts, or, as it says here, cutting out waste. But you've got to imagine, I mean, the last Conservative government were forever saying that they were cutting down on waste and improving efficiency. Surely to goodness there can't be that much left to cut. So yeah, she's really got herself into a real fankle. And you mentioned there as well about her fiscal rules. You know, the Treasury put out a statement a few days ago saying they are absolutely wedded to those fiscal rules of bringing debt down as a proportion of the economy by the next Parliament. I mean, that leaves us so little room for manoeuvre. And, you know, if she were to come back and put up taxes again as an emergency measure, the political ramifications of that would be absolutely huge. So yeah, everywhere she looks right now, she's in an awful lot of trouble.
And just in terms of that, we talked about the fact that Treasury waded in, or you just mentioned that. The fact is they've had to support Rachel Reeves. I would have thought that actually that is a very warning and worrying sign for her. But also, according to this article, the support for her has evaporated. Even those members of Parliament who supported her are now saying that actually they don't support her anymore. I think the Labour MPs are so frustrated that what should have been the honeymoon of this administration is it's definitely over.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about it. It's definitely well and truly over. I think there's a lot of disquiet amongst Labour MPs way back to when she cut winter fuel allowance. You know, that is something that I know that Labour MPs are still getting in the neck from their constituents, from pensioners, or from those whose parents or grandparents are missing out on this payment, and they really think that was an unnecessary own goal. It doesn't actually raise all that much money, not when you take into account the fact that there's been this big drive to get more pensioners to claim pension credit so they also get their winter fuel allowance as well. Once you add that into the mix, it's not saving an awful lot of money at all, and they just don't realise why she decided to do it so early in the government's time in office. It's dogging them all the way up until the present day, and will continue to do so unless they find the money to U-turn on that, although I don't see that happening. So yeah, there's definitely disquiet at the Chancellor's performance. The one thing she's got in her favour though is that she is absolutely in lockstep with Keir Starmer. It's not a case of, you know, the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown years of number 10 and number 11 being at each other's throats. They're absolutely wedded politically together. So really, I think that probably saves her for the moment. But we do know that Keir Starmer can sometimes be pretty ruthless. So maybe a year or two down the line, things might change. But right now, I don't think her position is under serious threat.
And just in terms of that, I mean, Rachel Reeves is saying that China is crucial for UK growth. She's basically saying the reason I'm in China is because I can bring in 600 million quid to the economy over 5 years. That doesn't seem like a lot of money to me.
No, not in the grand scheme of things. It's not. And, you know, this trip, I think, has been really badly timed. Now, as you'll know, these trips are, there's a lot of planning goes in. It'll have been months in preparation. I think it would have been difficult for her to pull out at the last minute, that would have looked like she was panicking. So really, she had to go ahead with it. But timing-wise, it's not great for her to be out of the country when there is all this turmoil on the markets. The value of the pound is going down. As I say, the cost of government borrowing is going up. So I think she'd much rather be here, look like she's taking control of the situation rather than being overseas. And it is controversial that the UK seem to be cozying up to China at a time when other Western nations are looking to move away from China because they see them as a threat. So yeah, it is definitely a bit of a gamble, and she's really got to hope that it pays off.
Now, Keir Starmer obviously trying desperately to put a lid on the grooming gang scandal. The Daily Mail yesterday published a map which illustrated the full detail to the extent to which the grooming and rape culture spread across towns of England. So they say there are 41 towns in England where children and young women were targeted by these gangs, 76 gangs in total, taking in all corners of the country, from Plymouth to Ramsgate to Barrow in the northwest, Newcastle in the northeast. One of the most staggering facts here is that of the 396 known groomers to be convicted and jailed over the last 2 decades, 155 have been released and are back on the streets, many of them back on the same streets where they offended. This is a problem for Keir Starmer. It is not going away, and yet he whipped his MPs into voting against having a national inquiry.
Yeah, it's quite an astonishing story. You're right, and the fact that these men are back on the streets again, I think this will only add to the calls for a national inquiry. It was interesting that the government's position did subtly shift last week from being absolutely, we do not need a national inquiry, there's all these local inquiries, we've still got to implement the Alexis J inquiry recommendations. But there was a subtle, as I say, change in language, I think, from the Prime Minister and from the government as a whole, that, you know, they will listen to victims, and if the mood changes, if more victims say they want a national inquiry, I mean, not all victims say they want one, some say they don't, but a lot of them say they do. I think if that builds momentum, then I wouldn't rule out a national inquiry at some stage. But what he doesn't want to do, the Prime Minister, is give the Conservatives and Reform a win at this particular moment in time. They're obviously calling for a national inquiry now. I think it would be seen as weak for him to U-turn right away, but I think maybe further down the line I wouldn't rule out a national inquiry taking place, and I think stories such as this will only, as I say, increase calls for a national inquiry.
Well, of course, and Reform UK says they will carry out a national inquiry even if the government don't actually agree to it. There are two more stories in the press this morning. A serving Labour MP initially rejected calls for an inquiry into grooming gangs that found more than 1,000 children had been abused whilst authorities turned a blind eye. This is Sean Davis representing Telford in the Commons. He was leader of Telford and Wrekin Council. He wrote to the Home Secretary and Prime Minister in 2016 rejecting the call for an inquiry into child sexual abuse. You've also got Wes Streeting yesterday actually saying, well, hang on a minute, he said it's irresponsible and coarse public discourse. It could lead to more atrocities against Muslims if entire communities were vilified. I'm very mindful of the fact he only has a majority of 528 in Ilford North, and Nigel Farage has seized on this to say that Wes Streeting's remarks are insulting.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Wes Streeting's remarks in the round, I mean, he did say that, you know, what happened in the grooming gangs has been absolutely disgusting and people were let down. I think he's talking about the language, in particular language being used by Robert Jenrick, who's talked about medieval attitudes of alien cultures coming into this country. And I thought it was actually interesting that Steve Baker, the former Conservative MP, certainly no bleeding heart liberal, he said a couple of days ago that he's very concerned at the use of that type of language, which he said opened the door to racism. So yeah, I think there's that. Yeah,
but isn't this part of having an honest? But don't you think, Kevin, this is about having an open, honest debate about actually what is going on in this country? Who knew what? When did they know it? And why weren't we told what they knew?
No, absolutely, and as I say, that's why I think the calls for a national inquiry will only increase it, and I would not be surprised if ultimately that's what happened. There is clearly an awful lot of public anger. I think politicians on both sides of the political divide have to be careful in the language that they use, and you know, Wes Streeting has to be careful not to be given the impression that he is dismissing people's concerns. I don't think that's what he was actually trying to do, actually. But yeah, I can understand why, you know, his political opponents might want to leap on those comments, and that shows why it's such a politically difficult issue for Keir Starmer.
And of course for him, for Wes Streeting, Muslims are the largest religious group in Ilford North, where he is Member of Parliament. They make up a third of his constituency's population. How much of this is him actually trying to shore up support for his seat, do you think?
Well, as you said, I mean, he came perilously close to losing his seat in July, largely over the Gaza issue. I mean, we know that a lot of other Labour MPs weren't quite so fortunate as him and did lose large majorities to independent Gaza campaigners. So there's no doubt that he will be hearing concerns, I guess, from British Muslim voters in his area, that they say that they feel perhaps being persecuted and being tarred with the same brush as those involved in the grooming gang. So I can understand where he's coming from as a constituency MP, obviously. But as I say, this is such a difficult issue now for the government, and more stories like the one in the Mail yesterday will only, as I say, increase calls for a national inquiry, I think.
And also, if I can just bring in the front page of the Daily Mail this morning, or the Sunday Mail, Musk and Cummings in a plot to sabotage UK politics. This big story about Elon Musk coming together with Dominic Cummings to tweet about the Labour government. We know Elon Musk has been prolific on X, talking about the incompetence of the Labour government. Labour on the front foot here, saying that you can tell that this is to do with Cummings because these tweets are sent at a time when it's daytime here in the United Kingdom, but that Musk would actually be asleep at that particular point. I would argue that you can actually make sure that you schedule those X's to go out at particular points. There's an interesting story in The Spectator which starts the refusal of Western elites to admit the failings of multiculturalism and their ongoing mollycoddling of minority vested interests is giving birth to white identity politics, the troubling big picture that is taking place here in the UK. I'm paraphrasing this. But it goes further, and it's a really important point. It says any astute progressive political leader would sense a major shift in the tectonic plates of public opinion and would be adjusting his tone accordingly. But Starmer has sought to pillory white working class people and anyone else angry about shocking atrocities as far right. Do you think Starmer is tone deaf?
On this issue, I think his language was a little bit loose in the press conference that he gave last Monday. I think what he was trying to say, he was accusing the Conservatives basically of jumping on a far-right bandwagon, as he would describe it. You know, he's talking about Elon Musk lionising Tommy Robinson, saying he should be released from prison, but also, you know, backing these calls for a national inquiry. Then the Conservatives come out and do it, and I think that was what he was getting at. The problem was that the language he used gave the impression, certainly, that perhaps he was saying that those who wanted an inquiry were far right. I don't think that is what he was trying to say. I think he was attacking the Conservatives, and his spokesman clarified that later on. But yeah, again, it just shows the importance of politicians being careful with their language. And that story on the front of the Mail on Sunday is absolutely fascinating. I think it's an interesting political love triangle almost. You've got Elon Musk, Dominic Cummings and Nigel Farage all in the same space.
Well, Nigel Farage says they've kissed and made up.
Fascinating, isn't it? Especially when you see what Elon Musk said about him.
Well, that's very true. Also, just in terms of Labour's tenure in office, the third private school in a week has closed after Labour's introduction of VAT on fees at the start of the month. This is Godolphin Prep, opening in 1993. It says we now have to shut. Of course, private schools are being levied with VAT and business rates. We talked about it this morning, about this as ideology over practicality of policy. It just seems that in the 6-7 months that Labour has been in power, none of these policies have been really thought through, and particularly the impact of those policies and the ramifications of those policies. Take these kids, for example. Where are they going to go to school?
Well, you're right. They're going to have to go into the state system, which obviously means that it's a bigger drain on the state's resources. Now, the whole point, we were told, of this policy was that it was going to raise millions of pounds in extra taxation, which was going to be used to employ more maths teachers. But if the unintended consequence is the closure of these schools, and then those pupils having to go into the state system, or parents pulling their kids out of schools or choosing not to send their kids there in the first place, it means that the state school population is going to go up, which obviously means that they've got to be paid for. So again, in the final reckoning, the money raised may not be actually what the government or what Labour said it would be before the election. And you're right, there's been a series of mistakes by the government. Some of them you would have thought were quite easily foreseeable, and you wonder, it's not as if it was a surprise that they won the election. They'd been miles ahead in the polls for a very long time indeed. It does look as though the planning wasn't what it should have been, which I think is leading to quite a lot of the problems that they're experiencing now.
And in your experience, just in terms of Keir Starmer, how does he turn this around? How does he get on the front foot? How does he move the political agenda forward? Because they keep changing this. They keep trying to have relaunches, and it hasn't worked.
I think it's all about results, really. It's people feeling that they're better off in their pocket. The cost of living crisis finally being over. There's no sign of that right now. It's about the NHS being improved. It's about people being able to get an appointment with a GP when they want one. That's the things that people will focus on. The things that guys like you and I maybe get interested in, the political minutiae and the gossip and who's up, who's down. I think ordinary people actually are more concerned about what is the government doing for me? Are they making my life better? And unless the government prove that they can do that, then I think they're in for a pretty tough time.
And, of course, not helped by headlines like this one. Corridor care nurses to ease NHS bed crisis. They're now recruiting nurses to look after people in corridors in hospitals. This is a slew of terrible headlines for Keir Starmer. It remains to be seen whether he can actually turn it around. Kevin, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Kevin Schofield, their political editor at Huffington Post UK.